Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and I am the host of the podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. We also go a little astray, a little farther off, and sometimes we talk about Plum Island. And if you're watching this on TV, rather than listening, you can see that a graphic of Plum Island is in front of you. And we're going to be talking about that in a moment. But first, I wanted to mention a very sad thing that occurred on the river in recent days. It started late last week and actually continued a few more days. A young family from the Lowell area came down. They were on Deer Island. They were fishing. They were a bit inexperienced at fishing, I would think, and also at swimming. And you may have read about it or heard about it because, it was a tremendous sadness. But beyond that, it was an enormous gathering of public officials to try to find this family who had fallen into the Merrimack. So basically, I think about Thursday, late afternoon, there was a husband and wife, two youngsters, maybe 5 and 7. They were on Deer Island. They were on the island itself. They did not have a boat. But one of the youngsters, he was about 6 years old, he fell into the river. And so this is a bad thing because the river runs very rapidly there and it's very cold. And this is a big thing. The possibility is hypothermia. And I covered this when I lived in Maine, and I covered a lot of drownings as a journalist in Maine. And in May and June, the water is still very cold and your body does not work as fluently when it's cold. It's harder to breathe. It's harder to move your arms. So it's quite possible that this youngster who was 6 was not able to swim or not able to right himself. His mother, who was about 28 or 30, went into the water to try to get him. Also a daughter, a little older, I think 7 or 8, also tried to go in and get the small brother. Now this is understandable because initially he was not very far from the shore. But the mother was not a good swimmer. She could not actually catch up with her son. And the current, and again, this is Deer Isle, if you're familiar with the area, this is an area of very quick movement of the water, started pushing him away. She was pushed away. She was not a very good swimmer. And the young girl, the daughter, also was in the water trying to save the youngest of the family. So one of the good elements was there was a boat nearby and the boat was able to come along. The boater picked up the young girl, was able to pick up the mother, as I understand it through the media, but they did not see the youngster anymore. Now the father had already also gone into the water. They were able to get him back onto the shore. So you had 3 people on the shore and the 6-year-old boy was missing. It must be said that the mother was in a very bad condition. She was overcome by hypothermia. They rushed her to Anna Jake's Hospital, but she died. And then for a day or two, the young boy, the 6-year-old, was missing. But recently, in the last day or two, his body has been found. So the mother is deceased. The young boy is deceased. The father is still healthy, and the daughter is also survived. So that is a very sad story. And, these happen several times a year in different ways. A boat will go over, in the middle of the bay, or there'll be a vessel will have trouble getting back into the harbor because, as we've talked about on this show, this is a very tough harbor to get in and out of because you have a strong current from the river going to the east. You have a significant tide from the west. Sometimes they're in accord, like if it's a falling tide, but on other situations if you have an incoming tide and you have a tough current, it's very difficult. There's a lot of churning and a lot of high waves. And I did a paper for the Coast Guard several years ago. I was working with them on making life safer along the river. And one of the Coast Guard's real priorities is getting a life jacket on everybody, not just in the vessel, but along the water. And I think here we saw, the fact if they had, full life jackets on, it may have been a better outcome. And as I understand it, the youngsters were not good swimmers, nor were the parents. And that reminds me, another thing that I frequently think of is this area, Newburyport and the surrounding area, really needs another pool. Now, there is one at the YW, and it's quite busy. It's quite expensive when I tried to join it. But, we really need another pool in this town so youngsters can learn how to swim well. It just doesn't work to say, well, they can swim in the ocean. It's very hard to learn to swim in this ocean. Sometimes there are waves. Sometimes it's very cold. Sometimes there are riptides. It is not a good place to learn how to swim. Now, there are lakes and whatever around. But this is one thing that I would think was a very good idea in the future, to try to get another pool in the area. And actually, the tennis club in Newburyport, which is on Low Street, the unprestigious Low Street where I live, the tennis club is thinking about putting a pool in there. I don't know if it would be open in summer or open in winter as well. They're working with city officials on it. So that would be kind of interesting. And for me, it's not so much sitting in the sun in the summer, but in the winter, it's getting a lot of youngsters in, learning how to swim, learning how to save lives. And so that is something that I hope. And again, we all hope that people are more diligent about wearing life jackets. Sometimes I sit down at the river's edge here in Newburyport, and you'll see, say a 20 or 22 footer, an outboard perhaps. They have 4 young guys, 4 young gals there. It looks like they have a case or 2 of beer. It looks like tremendous amount of fun. But they should be wearing safety jackets. And I know I sound like an old fogey, because probably at that age, I didn't pay too much attention to it. But every time you have a situation like we just saw here at Deer Isle, losing, 2 wonderful human beings, it just reminds us that this isn't a quiet lake. The Merrimack River has taken a lot of lives. As we said, it has a strong current, it has tidal motion. It can be a tough place. So maybe if people wore, the safety jackets more frequently, it would be good. And maybe, and I know this is true, if young people took only 1 case of beer out on the water rather than 2 or 3 cases, that would probably be better also. But anyway, summer's coming, and I think a lot of people are ready to have a good time. I was down to Plum Island 2 weeks ago, and the one day it was about 85. And I got down there pretty early. I was going to read the Sunday paper, look over the proofs of my new book on Plum Island. And I got there, as I say, reasonably early. I think it was 11. I got there at 11. I knew I would not make Sandy Beach out at the south end. But nevertheless, there was a very long line. It took me a half hour, in the line. I thought I was outside of, one of the Boston tunnels for a moment. But finally, after a half hour, I did get in, and I got a parking place in parking lot number 1, which I felt, boy, if it takes me a half hour even to get in here, how am I ever going to get a parking spot? But I did get one, and I spent several hours there. It was very pleasant. As you know, most of Plum Island Beach, and you can see it here in the graphic, is off limits to swimmers or hikers or fishermen at this point, because the plovers are mating. They want the, just about the whole length of Plum Island is off limits to swimmers. And so that lasts until about July, late July. And then the greenheads arrive. But we're durable people, and we can get through this. So that was one thing about the Merrimack River that struck me this week. And it struck everyone, actually. It was a terrible tragedy. Another thing that I was taken by was the Globe had a story on Rachel Carson. And she you might remember, was a writer in the old days. And this goes back to the 40s and 50s. And they did a story about Silent Spring, which was one of her famous books. Here is a picture of Rachel Carson. She wrote Silent Spring in 1962. And so that would make it about 60 years from when she wrote Silent Spring. That was a tremendously influential book. It talked about some of the real detriments of pesticides. And for many years, she was vilified because she was a real brave woman, and she was a scientist as well. Here she's in her late 40s, I'm thinking, and she took a little different route, which is probably spoke to some of her success. She wasn't just a writer, because that can be a smarmy slope or a slippery slope. But from an early age, she was an employee of the U.S. Fish and Game Service. Now it's Fish and Wildlife, a federal agency, but she was with Fish and Game. She was born in Western Pennsylvania in a rural area. She loved fields. She loves the water. She went to Johns Hopkins University, which is near Baltimore, in Baltimore, but near the Barrier Islands off of Maryland and North Carolina. And she learned a lot about the ocean, the bays, and so she kept studying. She also studied at Woods Hole here in Massachusetts. So Johns Hopkins, Woods Hole, she did a couple more things. And she wrote 3 books about the ocean and, the elements coterminous to the ocean, which are pools, which are rivers, which are marshes. She was really on top of that stuff. And the one reason I bring it up, because in 1947, she was brought here to Newburyport to study the black duck. And she was in places like this. If I'm showing different slides now for those of you on radio, this is near Hellcat. This is a wonderful bird watching spot, which is probably much like it looked like when she was here in 1947. And here is a black duck. Rachel Carson's small role in 1947 was to try to put together an initiative that would compromise with hunters. A lot of bird watchers in 1947 wanted to watch birds, enjoy the black duck, and give them an area where they would be safe. But there are a lot of hunters, and there are really a lot of hunters who wanted to shoot the black duck. And, it's understandable, because hunting has been in the fabric of the North Shore for, decades, if not centuries. And this got to be a very big battle. It even went to Washington and landed on the desk of Harry Truman, who was president in 1947 and 1948. And his situation was the hunters wanted all of or most of Plum Island so they could hunt. But the bird watchers, who had a lot of money, and the federal government owned a lot of Plum Island at that time, did not want to give it all to the bird watchers. So they went back and forth and they compromised. But she was, very willing to compromise. She said, there are enough, we're losing black ducks right now. That's what she said. Now, again, this is 1947. But we can get them back. Let's give them part of Plum Island where you can hunt them, where they know they can come in and fly and eat and procreate. And then the outer areas of Plum Island, you can hunt them. And so you can get an amount of duck, but the ducks will eventually learn that there's a safe spot in the middle of the arena of Plum Island. And so that's what was finally worked out. That was Rachel Carson. And I, stressed again, she was not known for this. What she's known for is her fight against pesticides and her fight against some of the largest chemical companies in the country, including those down in Maryland, those in Washington, D.C., and Um, she would be brought in to testify before Congress, and these heavy-duty lobbyists and scientists that were hired by industry would say pesticides are good. They get rid of bugs. We have better plants. We have, animals grow up without ticks and things like that. And she kept saying, but the problem is pesticides are weakening the eggs of the ducks and the waterfowl. And so when the eggs come out of their mother, they're not strong enough to hold the fledgling in there. They break, the fledgling cannot survive. And I think this is one of the most amazing things, that through her data, she could learn that it was pesticides that were leading to weak eggs and thus a much smaller number. But she was a real pioneer here. Again, I say she was out on Plum Island in the fall of 1947. There was a lot of acrimony, and some people actually said, well, do you want to take a guard with you? Do you want to take a weapon with you? So she said, no, I'll do it. But she did, as I understand from one of her biographers, she did finally start taking a flask of whiskey out there. I don't think she'd throw that at any interlopers, but I do think it kept her company on those cold autumn evenings when she'd go out with a ranger or something. Here is a species that is doing very beautifully. These are Canada geese. As you can see, this is a wonderful shot of a family. It could be a mother and a father. It could be two mothers. It could be two fathers. Who knows? But that's certainly a very appealing photo, and that's one of my favorites. Now, the reason I'm talking about Plum Island, and I may have said this before, is I wrote a book, Plum Island, A Vulnerable Gem. That comes out June 27th. I have not seen the book, and I hope it's going to come out on time. But that is the reason why I have numerous slides of Plum Island. And there are many wonderful birds on Plum Island, as you know. Here's a wonderful shot of a snowy owl. This was taken by Dan Grovac, who lives on the island. He's not a professional photographer. He's an executive with a technology and health company. But isn't that a wonderful photo of a snowy owl here in Plum Island? And the eyes are remarkable. The way he catches the wings are just great. And it's always an excitement to see snowy owls. I know that I think there are more around now than there were, say, a decade ago, which is, I've got to think, is a good sign. But isn't that a wonderful photo? And here's a plover. And when I saw this the first time, I said, well, we were all little once, and then we grew up and became, real adult plovers or real adult people. But Dan Grovac took this also on Plum Island. And isn't that, a great photo of wildlife you can find out there? And again, Canada geese and other wildfowl are very prevalent out there. In recent weeks, there's been a lot of birds, and it's an exciting place to be. Also, as if you've been out there, either at dusk or in the evening, the sunsets are beautiful, the sunrises are beautiful, and it's a wonderful spot. Here is an example of another bird watching area. This is a hellcat, which is way out to the south. You have to go almost halfway down. But you park your car, there's parking for about 30 cars, and you walk along, you can't see them, but there's small paths on the left and the right here. And a tremendous number of birds come in here. Right now we're talking about the arrival, which is, April, May, and June, and thousands of birds come here, and it's a great spot. And one of the things that occurred, I think it was in 1988, but one of the great things, on Plum Island, on the southern end of Plum Island for many years, was the polio camp. And there's Camp Sunshine or something like that, where from about 1950 till about 1988, youngsters with polio and some other maladies would come there, and they had a nice pool. They had their own, bunkhouses, they could walk, and it was set up so if you were in a wheelchair, and again, this is youngsters, you can get from point A to point B, and they had plenty of counselors. And as I understand it, it was just the most wonderful couple of weeks of a young patient's life, where they could be out in the beauty of Plum Island. They're with other youngsters, who have the same challenges they do. And it was really known throughout the East Coast. It came to its end in about 1988, and a number of nonprofit executives wanted to take it over. But I think at that point, the federal government just made the decision, look, it had a good run. It was very valuable. Now we don't have polio, and they actually got rid of it. They said, no, we're not giving you any more permits. So this was their process of getting all of the buildings and institutions off of the federal part of Plum Island. And there was still, if we're talking the 80s, there was still a half a dozen houses there. And they said, the feds, they said, you folks can live there. We're not going to kick you out. But when your last existing heir dies, then, that's it. You're out of the house, and we're going to take the house. We'll pay you for it, but you can't keep living there. And that's what happened. I remember I was a journalist with the Daily News in about 2015, and I went out and did a story on the last resident of that part of Plum Island. And, they didn't want to leave necessarily, but her grandmother had died. They didn't have the authority to move in there. And so I was there when the Fish and Wildlife people were starting to close it up, and they hadn't at that time made plans as to whether to take it down or not. But it's just a poignant moment. There were many houses on Plum Island over the years that have been taken down because once the feds did get a hold of most of it, they said, we want this for wildlife. We don't want people living here. And so that was that. But it's still a retreat for wildlife. And here are some kayakers at Plum Island. This looks like a high tide. They're going through the marsh. And, that salt hay there has been put up to try to avoid high tide. But, threshing salt hay and then putting it up on those little decks they have to keep it out of the water. Now that goes back several centuries. It really does. I've seen pictures of that from 1860 or 1870. And before that, they probably did it, but there weren't any cameras then. The first camera shots were taken in about 1839, 1840. Newburyport was one of the first areas in the country to have cameras. And then cameras went on to another terrific expansion of their value when great photographers like Matthew Brady took his camera to the Civil War. And you can imagine how dynamic this must have been. Photography is only around, say, 1840. Matthew Brady has, it's photo gear. He goes to Gettysburg, among other places, and he takes these photos of not so much the action in war, but of the dead on the war fields, on the battlefields. And it was so, now I'm not making this up, it was so shocking when he had a studio in Manhattan. He'd bring them back, these photos. No one in any war in this country had ever seen photos of what a battlefield looks like. This is true. People were shocked, they were crying, they thought they saw their husband there, probably didn't, but so photography starting in, say, 1840 is really doing pretty well in 1860 and made a big difference, and still does in all our lives. So many people who go to Plum Island take photos, and they still use cameras in most cases. We all know how many folks take cameras on their phones. This is probably weighs several tons, and this is blown in by a storm a year ago, and you can see how strong the storm must have been to pull that off its mooring and get it onto the sea. As stated, here's some folks taking photos in the spring, and there's some very cute birds. I don't know, you've called this bird cute, but this is an osprey. This is a tremendous photo. PBS did a show on ospreys last fall. It's one of the best shows I've ever seen on TV, not just about naturalism, but for anything. And that includes Dyke Patriot football victories. It was terrific. So here's an osprey. They went to the Connecticut River, which is very much like the Merrimack, and they spent just about a year with these ospreys. The father comes up a little sooner, maybe in March or April. The mother comes up a little later, makes the decision on whether the father has built a decent nest and whether he passed muster on that one. But then they start their family. Both ospreys do a lot of fishing. They get almost 100% of the food from fishing. And it's a tremendous bird, and there are numerous ospreys in this area. Here's the old seagull. And I won't go into it, but the Plum Island airport is one of my favorite things. It started in 1909, not here, but half a mile the other way. But if you consider the Wright brothers were only getting in the air in 1903, and these folks are started in 1909, it's quite amazing. The Coast Guard is one of my favorite subjects. I wrote a book called New England Coast Guard Stories. Here's a great photo of the Coast Guard off of Plum Island. Everybody is wrapped up tightly. No one fell off, but it can be very, very, well, not scary for them. They're used to it. They train. In fact, one of the excitements they have, it looks like 18 to 20 footers. Let's go out and drill. So they're not scared of it. They revel in it. But here's a wonderful photo. And of course, sunset in this area is just a beautiful thing. Dan Grovac, who I mentioned a moment ago, took this wonderful photo of a humpback whale off of Plum Island. Isn't that amazing? And if you use the term under duress sometimes, I think these pogies, also known as menhaden, were kind of under duress that day because, he caught this action and, there must be 24 fish either getting blown out of the water or about to enter a very large and gaping mouth. But what a great photo. And here's also a wonderful shot, sunset. There are many boats go out. The Charo's family has boats that go out for fishing boats. They go out for, cruises such as this, a sunset cruise. They also go out on booze cruises where they have bands. And, this, you probably know this if you're around here, but this is a wonderful area in which to live. We have the river, we have the bay, we have Plum Island, we have the Atlantic. It's an incredible place. Oops, we weren't supposed to get to that non-approved photo. But anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. This is Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. We're on 96.3 Joppa FM radio. We're on Channel 9 local cable TV, and we're also archived on YouTube. So we're about finished for today. I did want to talk a little about the two people in that family who passed away, and I think our thoughts and prayers are with them, with the survivors, and hoping the father and the daughter now are left, and hoping they can find a way back into the world. As I understand it, a number of people who lived down right in that area of Deer Isle really were helpful. They took the law enforcement people in for coffee or bathroom breaks. They took the surviving father and surviving daughter in because, they couldn't go home knowing their little boy might come up on shore. Anyway, it was a very bad moment. These things do happen. So, like the Coast Guard, I would say, wear seatbelts, stay sober, and make sure you're a good swimmer. Because if you get into a swift current in very cold water like this, it can be very dangerous. So that's it for this week. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. We'll be back again. I'm having guests in the next 2 weeks, and we'll enjoy talking about life on the Merrimack. Thank you very much.